The chamber doors closed behind me with a sound like a final verdict, and I knew before a single word was spoken that we had already lost. My name is Daniel Marsh, and I was the third human ever allowed to stand inside the great chamber of the Galactic Council. I had trained for this moment for 2 years. I had studied the customs of 11 different species, memorized greeting rituals, practiced the careful posture that showed respect without showing weakness. None of it mattered. The moment I walked onto the speaking floor, I felt hundreds of eyes, some with pupils, some without, some made of light instead of tissue, all turned toward me with the same expression. Not curiosity, not caution, amusement. A tall delegate from the Threll Assembly rose first. His skin shimmered like oil on water, and his voice carried through the chamber without him raising it at all. The Council recognizes the representative of the species designated human, he said, and the word human came out of his mouth like something distasteful, something he wanted to spit out quickly. Let the record show that Earth has requested full membership in the Galactic Council for the 3rd time in 1 century. Laughter rippled through the chamber. Not loud laughter. Worse than that. Quiet, controlled amusement, the kind shared between people who already know how the conversation will end. I stood at the podium and delivered the speech I had rehearsed 100 times. I spoke about human achievement, about how we went from horse-drawn carts to walking on our own moon in less than 70 years. I spoke about our resilience, our ability to adapt, our history of overcoming disasters that should have destroyed us. I spoke with everything I had. When I finished, the silence that followed was worse than any laughter could have been. A delegate from the Korvath Directorate stood next. She had 4 eyes, and all 4 studied me like I was a specimen pinned to a board. "You speak of achievement," she said, "yet your species has fought over 8,000 wars in your own recorded history. You have not achieved peace, even among yourselves. How can the Council trust a species that cannot stop harming its own kind to join a union built on cooperation?" I opened my mouth to answer, but she was not finished. "Your technology is centuries behind the lowest-ranked member species. Your ships cannot survive a single jump through true FTL space without shredding apart. Your biology is fragile. You die from things as simple as unfiltered water, and yet you stand here, asking to sit among civilizations that have existed for tens of thousands of years." More laughter. This time it did not bother hiding itself. I looked around the chamber, searching for even one face that did not carry contempt. I found none. Species who had barely mastered basic technology when Rome was still an empire looked down at us like we were insects that had wandered too far from the dirt. Species who could not tie their own fate together without a council to hold their hand looked at us and called us primitive. The Threll delegate spoke again, and this time his voice held something close to boredom. "The Council has reviewed the application of Earth. The vote is unanimous. Humanity is denied membership. Furthermore, the Council formally classifies Earth as a quarantine world. Human vessels are barred from all Council trade lanes, all FTL corridors, and all diplomatic exchange until such time as the species demonstrates sufficient growth." Quarantine. The word landed on me like a physical weight. We were not being told to wait and try again. We were being told to disappear. I stood at that podium for a long moment, and I felt something shift inside me. Not sadness, not even anger, not yet. Something colder. Something that would take years to fully understand. The Korvath delegate leaned toward the delegate beside her and said something I was not meant to hear, though the chamber's acoustics carried it perfectly to where I stood. "They will not survive another century without us. Mark my words, the universe does not wait for the weak." I gathered my notes, though I did not need them anymore, and I walked out of that chamber without saying another word. There was nothing left to say that they would have listened to. Outside, on the transport platform overlooking 1,000 ships from 1,000 worlds, I stood alone and watched them come and go, gliding through space, with an ease that made our best engineering look like a child's toy. I thought about home. I thought about the scientists who had worked without sleep to build our first working prototype of a jump drive, only for the Council to call it a toy. I thought about every soldier, every engineer, every ordinary person on Earth who had no idea their entire species had just been judged and found lacking by people who had never once bothered to understand them. I made a promise to myself that day, standing on that platform with the cold light of 100 alien stars around me. I did not know how, and I did not know when, but I promised that the Council would remember this day, not with laughter, not with contempt, with something else entirely. I did not know then how soon that promise would be tested, or how much it would cost. I only knew that we had been dismissed, and dismissed people have nothing left to lose. I flew home in silence. The journey took weeks using our fastest available transport, since we were not permitted to use council lanes anymore. I spent most of that time staring out the viewport, replaying the laughter in my mind, letting it settle into something useful instead of something painful. By the time Earth came into view, blue and quiet and completely unaware of how the wider universe saw it, I had already decided one thing. We would not beg again. If the galaxy wanted to underestimate us, we would let it. Underestimation, I had learned, was a gift disguised as an insult, and one day, I suspected, it would be the very thing that saved us. I had no idea just how right I was. 3 years passed. Life on Earth continued, mostly unaware of how close the Council had come to erasing us from the wider conversation of the galaxy. I returned to active service, transferred to a listening post far beyond Mars, one of a handful of stations we maintained to watch the edges of explored space. It was quiet work. Long shifts, empty screens, the occasional flicker of a passing Council vessel too far away to notice us, since we were, after all, quarantined and beneath their attention. I worked alongside a small team, people who had become more like family than colleagues over those years. Captain Grace Bennett ran the station with a calm, steady confidence that made even the longest shifts bearable. She had a habit of humming old songs under her breath while reviewing data, and somehow it made the isolation feel less heavy. Beside her was Oliver Grant, our systems engineer, a man who could coax function out of equipment that should have been scrapped a decade earlier. And there was Lucy Hart, our youngest analyst, sharp-eyed and endlessly curious, the kind of person who noticed details everyone else missed. It was Lucy who noticed it first. I remember the night clearly. The station lights were dimmed for the overnight cycle, and most of the crew had gone to their bunks. I was finishing a routine report when Lucy's voice cut through the quiet, tight and careful in a way that made my stomach drop before she even said a full sentence. "Daniel, I need you to look at this." I crossed the room to her console. On the screen was a reading unlike anything I had seen in 3 years of monitoring deep space. It was not a ship signature. It was not a natural phenomenon. It was something in between, a mass reading so dense that our instruments struggled to process it, appearing and disappearing at the edge of our sensor range like it did not fully belong to the same universe we did. "What am I looking at?" I asked. "I don't know," Lucy admitted. "The gravitational signature doesn't match anything in our database. It's not matter as we understand it. The closest description I can give you is dark matter, structured and organized, moving with purpose." Grace joined us moments later, still in her sleep clothes, hair pulled back hastily. She studied the readings for a long moment without speaking. "Structured dark matter," she finally said. "That shouldn't be possible. Dark matter doesn't interact with itself in ways that would allow construction. Unless someone found a way to make it interact," Oliver said quietly from across the room, not looking up from his own screen. "Unless someone built something out of it." The 4 of us stood in that dim room, staring at a reading that made no logical sense, and none of us said what we were all thinking. Whatever this was, it was not natural. It moved with intention. It appeared at the edges of council space and vanished again, as if testing, as if watching. We sent our findings up the chain immediately, flagged as highest priority. It took nearly 2 days to get a response, and when it came, it was not what any of us expected. The council had already been informed, we were told, and the council had dismissed it. Sensor error, they claimed. Instrument malfunction. Unsurprising given the primitive nature of human technology. We were advised, not for the first time, to recalibrate our equipment and refrain from sending unverified reports through diplomatic channels reserved for member species. I remember the anger in that room when the message came through. Grace read it twice before setting her tablet down carefully, as though throwing it would not have satisfied her the way she wanted. "They didn't even look at the data," she said. "They didn't have to," I answered. "We're not real to them. Our warnings don't count as warnings. They count as noise." But we kept watching anyway. Over the following weeks, the readings grew more frequent. What had once been a single flicker at the edge of our range became multiple signatures, moving with a coordination that made my skin crawl every time I looked at the data. Lucy worked longer hours than any of us, cross-referencing every scrap of information we had, trying to build a picture out of fragments. "They're not just appearing randomly," she told me one evening, exhaustion heavy in her voice. "Look at the pattern. Each appearance is closer to a populated system than the last. It's not searching, it's approaching." I looked at the star map she had built, red markers tracing a path that led directly toward one of the Council's more populated border worlds, a planet called Ventrali Prime, home to nearly 2 billion members of the Threll Assembly. The same Threll Assembly whose delegate had looked at me with such contempt 3 years earlier. I sent another report, and another, each one more urgent than the last, backed with more data, more analysis, more careful language designed to make the threat impossible to dismiss. Each one came back the same way: dismissed, ignored, filed away by administrators who had already decided our warnings were beneath their attention. Grace eventually stopped waiting for permission. She authorized us to begin building a full sensor sweep, using every piece of equipment on the station, some of it decades old, cobbled together in ways that would have made Council engineers laugh even harder than they already did. But it worked. Slowly, piece by piece, we began to understand what we were looking at. They were ships, not built from metal or alloy or any material we could name, but from dark matter itself, given form and structure through means we could not begin to explain. They did not reflect light. They did not emit the kind of energy signatures our instruments were designed to detect easily. They existed at the edge of visibility, both physically and in the data we collected, like something that did not fully want to be seen. And there were more of them every week. I remember the night Oliver finally said out loud what the rest of us had been avoiding. "I don't think these are explorers," he said, staring at the accumulated data spread across 3 screens. "I don't think they're curious about us at all. I think they're gathering. I think this is what a fleet looks like before it moves." Nobody argued with him. Nobody could. We sent one final report before the attack came, more detailed and more desperate than any before it, warning the Council in plain, unmistakable language that something was massing at their border, unseen and unmeasured by their own instruments, visible only through the crude, patched-together technology of a species they had already decided was beneath their notice. That report, like all the others, disappeared into the same silence. I sat at my station that final quiet night, watching the numbers climb, watching the pattern tighten around Ventrali Prime like a hand slowly closing into a fist, and I thought about the chamber I had stood in 3 years earlier. I thought about the laughter. I thought about the delegate who told her colleague that the universe does not wait for the weak. I wondered, with a chill I could not shake, whether anyone in that chamber understood yet that weakness was never the trait they should have been worried about. None of us slept that night. We didn't need to be told what was coming. We could see it building on our screens, hour by hour, a storm gathering at the edge of a galaxy that refused to look up and notice the sky had changed color. I remember watching Lucy's hands shake slightly over her console, not from fear exactly, but from the strange, heavy weight of knowing something enormous was about to happen and being powerless to stop it. Grace stood behind her chair with her arms crossed, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the readings as if staring hard enough might change what they showed. "They're not moving anymore," Lucy said quietly, just before dawn cycle on the station. They've stopped just outside sensor range of Ventrali Prime. Holding position. Holding position for what? Oliver muttered, though it wasn't really a question. We found out less than 6 hours later. The first transmission from Ventrali Prime came through garbled and broken, cutting in and out through layers of static that our equipment struggled to clean up in real time. I sat frozen at my console, listening to a voice speaking in the clipped formal dialect of the Threll assembly, a voice that had clearly abandoned every trace of the calm superiority I remembered from the council chamber. They were not describing an attack. They were describing an erasure. The dark matter ships had not fired weapons in any way our sensors recognized. Instead, wherever they passed, matter simply stopped behaving the way it should. Shields failed instantly, not from damage, but from some deeper interference we could not explain. Ship hulls, built from some of the strongest alloys in known space, folded and collapsed as though the very laws holding their molecules together had been quietly switched off. Entire defense fleets, praised for generations as the finest engineering in the galaxy, were gone within minutes, not destroyed in the way we understood destruction, but unmade. Grace stood beside me, listening to the same broken transmission, her face pale in the low light of the station. "They're not fighting a war," she said quietly. "They're demonstrating one." The transmission cut out completely, less than 10 minutes later. We tried every frequency we had access to, every relay point still functioning, and found nothing but silence where Ventrali Prime used to be. Within hours, the Council's emergency channels, the same channels that had ignored every warning we sent them, exploded with activity. Every species with a border near the affected region scrambled for information. Every fleet with FTL capability rushed toward defensive positions. Every diplomat who had once dismissed our reports now demanded to know why nobody had told them this was coming. Nobody mentioned that we had. I watched the panic unfold across intercepted Council communications with a strange, hollow feeling in my chest. Species that had spent centuries perfecting their weapons, their shields, their strategies, found themselves facing something none of their technology could touch. Ships vanished. Stations went dark. Entire fleets sent to reinforce the border simply stopped transmitting, one after another, as the dark matter ships advanced with a slow, patient inevitability that felt less like war and more like weather. It took 4 days for someone in the Council to remember that Earth existed. The request came through an emergency channel late one evening, formatted with a strange, careful politeness that felt almost desperate in its attempt to sound official. The Council was requesting, not demanding, human assistance in gathering intelligence on the dark matter anomaly. Our equipment, they now claimed, had shown unusual resilience in early detection. Our reports, though initially unverified, were now considered, in hindsight, remarkably accurate. I read that message twice before I let myself feel anything about it. Grace called an emergency session with Earth Command within the hour. I sat in on the call from the station, watching faces from every branch of our unified defense forces argue over what to do. Some wanted to refuse outright, to let the Council face the consequences of their own arrogance. Others argued that whatever this threat was, it would not stop at Council borders forever, and refusing to act now might simply mean facing it later, alone, with even less warning than we had already been given. In the end, it was a simple, practical argument that won the room. If the dark matter ships could unmake fleets built with the galaxy's finest engineering, then perhaps our very difference, our so-called primitiveness, might be the only thing that gave us a chance to survive contact with them. I was assigned to the first human response team, alongside Grace, Oliver, and a handful of others pulled from stations across the system. We were given command of a small fleet, 4 ships built from parts, scavenged, repaired, and reinforced over years of operating without Council support. Our largest vessel, a converted cargo hauler renamed the Horizon, became our flagship, less because of its power and more because it was the only ship large enough to coordinate the others. I remember standing on the bridge of the horizon as we prepared to leave, looking out at a crew of engineers, soldiers, and scientists who had spent their entire careers being told they were not good enough to matter, now being asked to save the very people who told them that. Nobody complained. Nobody hesitated. If anything, there was a strange kind of quiet determination in the air, the kind that comes from finally being given a chance to prove something everyone secretly already believed about themselves. We arrived at the edge of the affected region 3 days later, guided by coordinates the Council reluctantly shared, a rare gesture that told me more about their desperation than any words could have. What we found defied easy description. Where Ventrali Prime once orbited peacefully, there was now a region of space that seemed subtly wrong, as though the light itself moved differently there. Debris drifted in slow, silent fields, remnants of ships and stations that had not so much been destroyed as unraveled. And moving through it all, patient and unhurried, were the dark matter ships themselves, visible now not as flickers at the edge of sensor range but as vast, shadowed shapes that seemed to drink in light rather than reflect it. Grace's voice was steady, despite the tension in the room. Passive scans only. Nobody powers up an offensive system until we understand what we're dealing with. We spent the next several hours simply observing, gathering every scrap of data our patched-together equipment could manage. It was Oliver who noticed the detail that would change everything. "Their systems are networked," he said, studying a data stream that made little sense to the rest of us. "Every ship, every movement, it's all connected through some kind of shared field. When one adjusts position, they all adjust position. It's not command and control the way we understand it. It's closer to a single mind operating through many bodies." "So if we disrupt the network," Lucy said slowly, working through the implication in real time, "we might disrupt all of them at once. Or we might have no idea what we're disrupting and make things worse," Grace cautioned. "We don't fully understand what that field even is." It was a fair warning, but the Council fleets gathering nearby, watching from a cautious distance, were running out of options faster than they were running out of caution. Word came through that another populated system, smaller but still home to nearly 40 million beings, sat directly in the projected path of the dark matter fleet's slow advance. We did not have the luxury of unlimited observation time. I volunteered to lead a small reconnaissance team closer, using one of our smaller, more maneuverable vessels, a converted transport nicknamed the Marlowe by its crew. It was not glamorous, it was not powerful, but it was quiet, in every sense our patched-together technology could manage, and quiet, we were beginning to suspect, might matter more than strength against an enemy like this. Grace argued against it initially, worried about the risk, but eventually agreed on the condition that we maintain constant contact and abort at the first sign of serious danger. I remember her hand on my shoulder before I left the bridge, a small gesture that carried more weight than any formal order could have. "Come back," she said simply. "That's the whole plan." The Marlowe slipped closer to the dark matter fleet under minimal power, running systems so basic that even our own scanners barely registered our presence. It was strange watching those massive shapes grow larger through the viewport, knowing that every advanced sensor system in the galaxy had failed to properly track them, while our simple, almost primitive approach let us slide closer without triggering whatever had doomed the Council fleets before us. "Something's different about our readings compared to what the Council ships reported," Lucy said quietly from her station, poring over data as it streamed in. Their systems relied entirely on networked, automated targeting and defense. Everything routed through central processing, shared across their whole fleet instantly. "And ours doesn't," I said, understanding building slowly. "Ours barely talks to itself," Oliver said, a note of dark humor in his voice despite the tension. "Half our systems are manually operated because we never had the budget or the permission to build anything fancier." It was, I realized in that moment, possibly the strangest advantage any species had ever stumbled into by accident. Every other species in the galaxy had spent centuries advancing toward more connected, more automated, more networked systems, trusting artificial intelligence and shared data streams to run their defenses more efficiently than manual control ever could. Humanity, denied access to that same collaborative technology, had been forced instead to build ships that worked independently, piloted and defended by hands and instincts rather than algorithms and shared networks. Whatever the dark matter ships were doing to unmake Council fleets, it seemed to depend heavily on interacting with exactly the kind of networked, automated systems we simply did not have. I did not fully understand it yet. None of us did. But for the first time since watching Ventrali Prime go silent, I felt something other than dread settle into my chest. It felt cautiously, dangerously, like hope. We gathered every scrap of data we safely could and retreated back toward the horizon before our presence risked drawing unwanted attention. The information we brought back would prove more valuable than any weapon the Council could have handed us. Because if the dark matter fleet's power depended on connection, then perhaps humanity's greatest weakness, our stubborn, old-fashioned insistence on doing things the hard way, by hand, without relying on networks we had never been allowed to build, was about to become the very thing that saved a galaxy that once laughed us out of its chamber. I did not know yet how costly that lesson would be to fully learn. I only knew, watching those shadowed ships grow smaller behind us as we retreated, that we finally understood something the entire Council did not. An understanding, I had learned long ago, was always the first step toward survival. News of what we found spread through the Council command network faster than anything we had ever sent them before. For the first time in my life, I watched alien voices speak about humanity with something other than contempt. It was not respect. Not yet. It was closer to disbelief, the kind that comes when someone realizes the thing they mocked might be the only thing standing between them and disaster. A joint war council was called within 2 days, held aboard a massive Threll command vessel positioned safely behind the front line. I was asked to attend, alongside Grace, representing the very species that ship's own delegates had voted to quarantine only a few years earlier. I remember walking through those polished corridors, past officers who avoided eye contact, past the same quiet, superior atmosphere I remembered from the council chamber, except now it was laced with something new: fear. The commanding officer, a Threll general named Vantrick, addressed the gathered delegation with clipped, careful words. "We require a strategy that does not rely on networked defense systems," he said, and I could hear how much the admission cost him. Human forces have demonstrated an ability to operate effectively in proximity to the enemy without triggering catastrophic system failure. We request their guidance. Grace stepped forward before I could. She had a way of commanding a room without raising her voice, and even here, surrounded by species who once dismissed her people entirely, that quality did not fail her. "Then you'll need to unlearn a few things," she said simply. "Fast." What followed was not an easy conversation. Species that had built their entire militaries around advanced automation and shared data networks were being asked to strip that away, to fight blind, to trust instinct and manual control instead of the systems they had relied on for generations. Many resisted. Some outright refused, convinced that abandoning their technology was a step backward they could not accept, even facing extinction. But others listened. Over the following days, our small human fleet worked alongside volunteer crews from several species willing to try something different. We taught basic manual override procedures to pilots who had never once flown without full computer assistance. We showed engineers how to build simple, disconnected backup systems using older, cruder technology, the kind humanity had been mocked for still relying on. It was slow. It was frustrating. Many crews struggled with tasks that felt beneath their advanced training, embarrassed to be learning what amounted to the basics from a species they once considered primitive. I remember one exchange clearly, with a young Korvath engineer named Cyril, who had initially refused to even sit through the training. "This is insulting," she told me on the second day, arms crossed, all 4 eyes narrowed with frustration. You are asking us to fly like children, without guidance, without the systems that make us capable. I'm asking you to fly like people who might actually survive, I answered. Your systems didn't make you capable. They made you comfortable. Those aren't the same thing. She did not answer that day, but by the end of the week, she was among the first to volunteer for the next reconnaissance mission, flying manually, without hesitation. The first real test came sooner than any of us wanted. Intelligence gathered from our earlier reconnaissance suggested the dark matter fleet was preparing to advance again, this time toward a cluster of smaller worlds that, while less populated than Ventrali Prime, still held millions of lives directly in its path. There was no time for a perfect plan. There was only time for the plan we had. We assembled a mixed fleet, human ships at the core, surrounded by volunteer vessels from a handful of species willing to strip away their reliance on networked systems and fight the way we had learned to fight, out of necessity, for our entire history. I stood on the bridge of the horizon as we approached the staging point, watching a display that showed our strange, mismatched fleet gathering in the dark. Ships built for elegance, flying alongside ships built for stubborn survival. It should not have worked. In some ways, it barely did. The engagement itself unfolded differently than any battle I had studied or trained for. There were no dramatic weapon exchanges, no clean lines of offense and defense. Instead, it became a slow, careful dance of avoidance and disruption, human pilots guiding allied ships through patterns designed to stay just outside whatever field allowed the dark matter ships to unmake network technology, while smaller, manually operated strike craft slipped close enough to test theories none of us were fully certain would work. I remember the moment Oliver's voice cut through the comm channel, tight with controlled excitement. Their field weakens when they're isolated from each other. If we can separate even a small group from the main formation, force them to operate independently, their systems struggle to compensate. It was Lucy who suggested the maneuver that would define the entire encounter, drawing on nothing more advanced than old naval strategy adapted for a battlefield none of us fully understood. Divide their formation the way old surface fleets used to divide enemy lines, she said. Force isolation, make them fight without their network. It should have sounded absurd, using tactics older than powered flight against an enemy built from the fabric of the universe itself. But absurd, I was quickly learning, described most of what humanity had ever managed to accomplish against impossible odds. We executed the maneuver with a coordination born less from advanced technology and more from stubborn, practiced instinct, human pilots and their newly trained allies weaving through the dark matter formation in patterns that confused its networked cohesion, isolating small clusters of enemy vessels one at a time. It was not a clean victory. I will not pretend it was easy or that it came without cost. We lost ships that day. I lost people I had trained beside, people who had trusted a plan built more on desperate theory than proven strategy. I remember Cyril's voice on the comm, steady even as her ship took damage, refusing to break formation even when instinct must have screamed at her to retreat. "Hold the line," she said, and I heard something in her voice that had not been there during our first frustrated conversation. Not arrogance, not superiority, understanding. By the time the dark matter fleet, isolated and disrupted, withdrew rather than press forward into a battlefield that no longer behaved the way it expected, our mixed fleet had done what no single council fleet had managed. We had made them retreat. It was not a victory that felt like triumph. It felt like survival, hard won and heavy with loss. I stood on the damaged bridge of the horizon afterward, looking out at a battlefield scattered with wreckage from both sides, and felt none of the satisfaction I might have expected. But something had shifted. Word of the engagement spread quickly through council channels, and for the first time, I heard our tactics described not as primitive improvisation, but as innovation. Species that had spent centuries perfecting elegant, interconnected systems began, cautiously, to ask questions about the old, disconnected methods they had abandoned generations ago. Grace found me later that evening, standing quietly near the observation deck, watching the stars. "You did good today," she said simply. "We lost people," I answered. "We did," she agreed. "And we saved more than we lost. That's the whole ugly math of it. It doesn't get easier, but it matters." I thought about Sorel, about the frustration in her voice that first day of training, replaced now by quiet respect, earned in the worst possible way. I thought about the delegates who once laughed at our supposed weakness, now studying our methods with careful, desperate attention. We had not won the war, not even close. The dark matter fleet, whatever it truly was, remained a threat far larger than a single skirmish could resolve. But for the first time since standing in that chamber years earlier, I understood something clearly. The galaxy had spent so long building itself toward elegance, efficiency, and interconnected perfection that it had forgotten the value of stubborn, imperfect resilience. Humanity, denied every advantage the Council held so dear, had been forced instead to master exactly the kind of resilience this enemy could not easily counter. They called it primitive once. Standing on that bridge, watching the last of the dark matter ships retreat into the dark, I finally understood that our so-called primitiveness had just saved a piece of the galaxy that once refused to even look at us with respect. It would not be the last time that lesson was tested, but it was the first time I let myself believe, fully and without doubt, that we might actually survive this. Months passed after that first retreat, though calling it peace would be generous. The dark matter fleet did not vanish. It regrouped, tested other borders, probed weaknesses across a dozen different systems, always retreating whenever it encountered resistance built on the same manual, disconnected methods we had introduced. Word of what worked spread quickly, and slowly, reluctantly, entire fleets across Council space began adapting, stripping away generations of comfortable automation in favor of the stubborn resilience humanity had never been allowed to outgrow. I spent those months moving between engagements, coordinating with crews from a dozen different species, watching old prejudices erode a little more with every battle fought side by side. Cyril became something close to a friend, her early frustration long since replaced by a fierce, practical respect that showed itself in small ways: an extra set of hands during repairs, a quiet nod of acknowledgement during briefings, small things that meant more coming from someone who once refused to even listen to us. The final major engagement came at a system called Doriel's Reach, a densely populated hub considered one of the most important trade junctions in known space. Losing it would not just mean loss of life, though the population numbered in the billions. It would mean losing the last major staging point standing between the dark matter fleet and the Council's most populated core worlds. I remember the briefing before that battle clearly, held aboard a combined command vessel packed with representatives from nearly every species still willing to fight. Grace stood at the front of the room, no longer treated as a curiosity or a reluctant necessity, but as one of the most experienced tacticians in the entire Allied fleet. "This isn't about winning cleanly," she told the room. "This enemy doesn't fight the way we're used to. We're not going to destroy them in some decisive final battle. We're going to make continuing this campaign too costly for whatever is driving them forward. We hold the line, we make them retreat again, and we keep doing that until they stop coming." It was not the kind of speech that inspired grand cheers. It was honest, heavy with the understanding that this fight might never end in the clean, satisfying way old stories promised. But it was the truth, and by then, every crew in that room, human and otherwise, had learned to value truth over comfortable illusion. The battle at Doriel's Reach lasted longer than any engagement before it, stretching across nearly 2 full days of near-constant strain. I will not pretend I remember every moment clearly. Exhaustion blurs details in ways that feel almost merciful in hindsight. But certain moments remain sharp, unwilling to fade. I remember Oliver's voice, hoarse from hours of continuous coordination, guiding a group of Allied engineers through emergency repairs on a Corvath vessel that had lost nearly all automated function, walking them through manual solutions with the same patient stubbornness he had once used to keep our own outdated station equipment running years earlier. I remember Lucy, barely into her mid-20s, calmly directing fleet movements across a dozen different ships, her voice steady, even as the tactical display in front of her showed losses mounting on both sides. And I remember the moment everything nearly fell apart, when a coordinated push from the dark matter fleet threatened to break through our formation entirely, isolating a cluster of Allied ships, Serrels among them, cutting them off from the support that had kept them safe through every previous engagement. I made the decision to lead a small strike group directly into that gap, the Horizon and 3 smaller vessels, cutting across a battlefield that had already claimed more losses than I wanted to count, hoping stubborn instinct and manual precision could buy enough time for reinforcements to arrive. I will not dramatize what followed. It was chaos, controlled only barely by training and desperation in equal measure. I remember the Horizon shuddering under strain it was never designed to withstand. I remember watching one of the smaller vessels in our strike group lose power entirely, drifting silent and dark, its crew's fate uncertain in the confusion of battle. I remember Serrel's voice on the comm, steady despite the danger, guiding her isolated group through a narrow gap we had managed to force open, buying just enough time. We held the gap for 11 minutes before reinforcements arrived. It felt considerably longer. By the time the dark matter fleet withdrew from Doriel's reach, retreating further than it had in any previous engagement, the cost had been steep. We lost ships, we lost people, human and alien alike, names I still carry with me, faces that appear sometimes in quiet moments I do not expect. But Doriel's reach held, the trade hub survived, billions of lives that would have been lost remained, uncertain but alive, in a galaxy that had finally, painfully, learned to fight smarter rather than simply stronger. I stood on the damaged bridge of the Horizon in the aftermath, watching Allied crews from a dozen species work alongside human engineers to coordinate repairs, watching old barriers of contempt and suspicion continue to erode under the simple, undeniable weight of shared survival. Grace found me there, exhaustion etched into every line of her face, but something steady in her eyes despite it. "They're calling for a new council session," she said quietly. "Full session, emergency priority." "About the fleet?" I asked. "About us," she said. "About Earth." I did not feel triumph hearing that. I felt something quieter, heavier, more complicated. I thought about every warning we had sent that went ignored. I thought about every life lost in the time it took the galaxy to finally listen. I thought about the chamber I had stood in years earlier and the promise I had made to myself as I walked out of it. "Good," I said finally. "It's about time." I did not know yet exactly what that session would bring, or how the galaxy that once dismissed us so completely would choose to face us now. I only knew, standing on that battered bridge surrounded by allies who had once been strangers and enemies who had once been friends of no one, that humanity had proven something no amount of laughter in that chamber could ever undo again. We were still here, and we were no longer easy to ignore. The chamber doors opened for me again, years after they had first closed behind me, with the weight of a final verdict. This time, I did not walk in as a supplicant. I did not carry rehearsed speeches or careful, practiced posture designed to earn approval I no longer needed. I walked in as someone who had already answered every question the council once used to dismiss us. The chamber looked the same as I remembered it, tall walls curving toward a ceiling that seemed to hold the light of 100 distant stars, delegates arranged in careful rows according to rank and standing. But the atmosphere had changed completely. There was no laughter this time, no quiet, shared amusement passed between delegates who assumed they already knew how the conversation would end. The Threll delegate, who once called our request for membership primitive, stood to address the room, and I noticed, with a quiet, private satisfaction I chose not to show, that his voice no longer carried the same careless superiority it once had. "The Council recognizes the representative of Earth," he said, "and this time, The word Earth did not sound like something distasteful. It sounded, for the first time, like a name spoken with something close to respect. I stood at the same podium where I had once been dismissed so completely, and I did not deliver the speech I had once rehearsed. Instead, I simply told the truth. I spoke about Doriel's Reach, about Ventrali Prime, about every engagement fought in between, about lives lost on both sides, while the council debated whether our warnings were worth their attention. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The truth, spoken plainly, carried more weight than any performance ever could. 3 years ago, I said, this council told my species that we were too fragile, too primitive, too disconnected from true progress to stand among you. You called our history of survival a mark of savagery instead of resilience. You dismissed warnings that, had they been heeded, might have saved lives that are gone now and cannot be brought back. I paused, letting the silence settle over the chamber, the way their laughter once had. You were not wrong that we are different. You were wrong about what that difference meant. The Korvath delegate, who once told me that the universe does not wait for the weak, sat quietly among her peers, 4 eyes fixed on me without the contempt I remembered from our first meeting. When she finally spoke, her voice held none of its former certainty. The Council acknowledges the contribution of human forces in the recent conflict, she said carefully, and formally reconsiders its prior classification of Earth. The vote that followed was not unanimous, not entirely. A handful of delegates, stubborn even in the face of undeniable truth, still hesitated. But the majority was clear, and this time, it was not laughter that filled the chamber when the result was announced. It was something closer to quiet, uncertain respect, the kind earned rather than given freely. Earth was granted full membership. Every restriction once placed upon us, the quarantine, the barred trade lanes, the denial of diplomatic standing, was lifted in a single session, undone as easily as it had once been imposed, though the cost of earning that reversal had been far higher than any signature on a formal document could reflect. I did not celebrate as I left that chamber. I thought instead about Sorel, and Oliver, and Lucy, and every crew member, human and alien, who had fought and bled to earn a respect that should never have needed to be earned through loss in the first place. I thought about every warning ignored, every life that might have been saved by a council willing to listen sooner. Grace met me outside the chamber, waiting near the same platform where I had once stood alone years earlier, watching alien ships glide past with an ease I had envied at the time. She did not ask how it went. She could see it clearly enough in my expression. Feels different than I expected, I admitted. It should, she said. We didn't get here by being liked. We got here by refusing to disappear. We stood together in silence for a while, watching the same steady flow of ships across the platform, though something about the sight felt different now. Less like a reminder of everything we lacked, and more like a reminder of how far stubborn persistence could carry a species the galaxy had once written off entirely. In the following months, Earth standing within the wider galactic community shifted in ways that would have seemed impossible only a few years earlier. Human tactics, once mocked as primitive, became studied and adapted across a dozen different fleets. Human engineers, once dismissed as behind the times, found themselves consulted by species that had spent centuries perfecting the very systems our stubborn independence had proven vulnerable. I returned to Earth briefly during that period, standing on familiar ground for the first time in longer than I cared to admit. It felt strange, walking through streets that had no idea how close their entire species had come to being erased from galactic relevance, and no real understanding yet of how much had changed while they went about their ordinary lives. I did not resent that quiet ignorance. If anything, I found comfort in it. Whatever we had endured out among the stars, home remained home, steady and unaware, exactly the kind of stubborn normalcy worth protecting. The dark matter fleet, though pushed back repeatedly across a dozen engagements, was never fully destroyed. It withdrew eventually, retreating toward the edges of known space, its purpose and origin still largely a mystery even after everything we had learned fighting against it. Council scientists, working now alongside human researchers for the first time, continued studying every scrap of data we had gathered, searching for answers that remained frustratingly incomplete. I do not know, even now, whether we have seen the last of them. Some nights, reviewing old sensor logs out of habit more than necessity, I notice small, faint irregularities at the edge of long-range detection, flickers that might be nothing more than instrument noise, or might be something else entirely, patient and distant, waiting. I try not to dwell on that possibility too often. There is enough work in the present without borrowing worry from an uncertain future. What I do know, standing now in a galaxy that finally sees humanity as something more than a curiosity to be dismissed, is this. We were laughed at. We were denied. We were told plainly and without hesitation that we did not belong among the stars. And when the moment came that truly mattered, when elegant, advanced, interconnected civilizations found themselves helpless against a threat their own perfection had left them unprepared for, it was humanity's stubborn, imperfect, hard-won resilience that held the line. I think about that chamber sometimes, the laughter that once filled it, the quiet respect that eventually replaced it. I think about every life lost proving a point that should never have needed proving in the first place. And I think, more than anything, about what comes next. Because whatever waits at the edge of that long-range static, whatever purpose drove those dark matter ships to test our borders in the first place, one thing has already been proven beyond any doubt the Council might still privately hold. Humanity does not disappear quietly. We never have. And judging by everything that has happened since that first humiliating day in the Council chamber, I suspect we never will. The stars that once dismissed us are still out there, endless and patient. So are we. And somewhere in the quiet dark beyond the edge of everything we have mapped so far, something is still watching, still waiting, still testing the edges of what it thinks it understands about the small, stubborn blue world that refused to disappear when it was told to. Let it watch. Let it wait. We will be ready.